I'm going to take you through the water bodies and rivers of Canada, trying to focus in on just introducing you to them, but also some key characteristics observed. First off, we have the Pacific Ocean over on the western or the left-hand side of the map. Up towards the top, we've got the Arctic Ocean. In this particular area, we have what is called the Beaufort Sea, B-E-A-U-F-O-R-T. We also have another sea on the other side of Canada called the Labrador Sea, as in the dog, which is essentially that Labrador Sea is a part of the Atlantic Ocean. So on one side, we have, of course, the Pacific, and on the other, we have the Atlantic Ocean, just like the United States. We also have these individual bays. We've got the Baffin Bay, B-A-F-F-I-N, which is in between Greenland and Canada. We also have the Hudson Bay, which is this big sucker right in the middle. It is essentially the bottom of a bowl. And we can see, once again, using the terrain map, that greens are going to be lower lying areas and browns are going to be higher elevated areas. And so, for the most part, everything is sloping in Canada towards the middle, towards the Hudson Bay. And we can see that with the rivers. So in Canada, for the most part, the rivers are flowing towards the Arctic Ocean. Now, these rivers might be flowing to the Hudson Bay, but the Hudson Bay eventually works its way to the Arctic Ocean to the north. There are some exceptions to that. We have over on the left-hand side, the western coast of Canada, the Fraser River, which works its way through the Rockies and the coastal range and works its way to the Pacific Ocean. We also have on the other side, very important, the St. Lawrence Seaway, in which that is very important, economically, no doubt about it, but it also flows towards the Atlantic Ocean from extreme southern and eastern Canada. So for the most part, these rivers, we see some exceptions, some rivers that flow to an inland lake, like we see up towards the top. We see the Great Slave Lake, which has those rivers, the Hay and the Slave, that flow into it. Very similar. We see that in Utah with the Great Salt Lake, has rivers flowing to it. So these rivers don't dump out into an ocean. They actually dump into an inland lake. But for the most part, all these rivers, if we follow them from their origin to their destination being somewhere blue, we can see for the most part, they're heading to the Hudson Bay. So think of this kind of as a bowl. Very important. Water always flows downhill. Also important when we think about water bodies in Canada, and also a good amount of the northern United States, is the role of glaciers. This big, huge continental glacier, which as it moves back, leaves behind big, huge chunks of ice that over time form a depression because of huge chunks of ice, as we learned previously in the glacial section. And eventually these huge chunks of ice create a depression. So eventually that depression fills with its own meltwaters. And so all throughout Canada, especially in areas where we saw the Continental Glacier was overhead, we see dotted with these lakes. So when we look at this particular area, the Canadian Shield and the Central Lowlands and the Great Plains up in this part of Canada, this interior part of Canada, it is for the most part flat. But because of all these lakes, it actually is kind of rugged. I know that kind of sounds weird, but if we look at it from the big picture view, yes, this is a flat area that on both sides, on the one side has the Appalachians, and on the other side has the Rocky Mountains, has these huge mountains on both sides, and so it's a relatively flat area in between. However, if we look at that rugged, if we look at it actually at the surface level, if you actually went to these areas, it is kind of rugged, the topography, and it has to do with it being recently impacted by a glacier, recently being in the last few thousand years. And so this glacier has retreated and has moved back over, presently over Greenland. And so the Hudson Bay is essentially, it's a big old lake. It's a sea because it's connected to an ocean. But all it is just essentially a depression formed from that glacier. Huge. We're talking a mile thick. Essentially created a depression, has since filled it. Subsequently, what's happening is the Hudson Bay, very weird. It's actually rising. It's rising because it no longer has that pressure of that overlying ice. And so it's what we call isostatic rebound. So it's a weird situation in which we have a lake that's actually shrinking, not because people are overusing the water or not allowing rivers to get to that lake or get to that inland sea. So essentially what's happening is actually the land is rising, and so subsequently the Hudson Bay is getting smaller. In the United States, the patterns are very similar, in which we have, mostly in the interior, we have these rivers. And once again, these rivers are working themselves. Where do they begin? They begin in upland areas. Once again, water likes to go downhill. So we have two main source areas for the water that's in these rivers. First off, it's up in the mountainous areas in which they get a good amount of precipitation. Combine that with the fact that you might have a winter in which that precipitation stays as snow, stays as ice, that eventually by spring melts and fills the water. Also, we have the case in the fact that the eastern part of the United States, it gets more rain. So, of course, with more precipitation, we're also going to have more water, and so thus more rivers. And so these rivers that work their way from the Rockies, from the west, work their way down slope, down the Great Plains, through the central lowlands, and essentially work their way to the middle of the United States where the Mississippi River is. So we look at most of the rivers throughout, if we look at the 2/3 of the United States, actually all work their way down to the Gulf of Mexico. We look on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, we don't really see too many major rivers. They're there, but they're nothing like the size and the volume that you see there in the interior. Similarly, in the west, we also don't see a lot of rivers, and that has to do with it being quite dry. But these rivers, they do snake their way through this very rugged physical environment and eventually make it to a coastline. We see that with the Colorado River, which actually starts over here in Colorado and works its way through Nevada and Arizona, where it carves out the Grand Canyon. So it's really a small river if we look at it in terms of its amount of flow. It's nothing like the Mississippi is down there in the southern United States. And so the Colorado River slowly carves out this very deep valley as it slowly trickles and snakes its way through the very, very, very rugged terrain of the western part of the United States. Finally, we have the St. Lawrence Seaway, which connects these very important inland lakes, the Great Lakes. And so the Great Lakes were formed from that most recent glacier. So it's very similar to the Hudson Bay, in which we have these large inland water bodies that were essentially formed as they fill a very large depression that was created from the ice scouring the landscape and then filling that scour, filling that carving that it took. So we have the Great Lakes. We've got Lake Superior. We've got Lake Michigan. We've got Lake Huron. We've got Lake Erie. And then we've got Lake Ontario. So those are our 5 Great Lakes, which then connect, each of them connect to each other via, naturally or via little canals, which eventually then connect to the St. Lawrence River, which then connects to the Atlantic Ocean. And so in this particular area, so if you're from the essentially the northern quarter of Indiana, the rivers actually flow to the north and they flow towards the Atlantic. Everything else, the White River, the Wabash River, the Ohio River, it all flows eventually to the Gulf of Mexico.